I've mentioned a couple times that I interned at a radio station called WABX in Detroit back in about 1981. And that was the first time I ever set foot inside a real radio station for any length of time. And I always loved ABX. ABX was one of the original album rock stations. And at one point in time, they were a freeform station. It was really, really cool. And one of the pioneers in FM radio. And so I worked there for a little while as an intern. And I went off to work in radio. And I bounced around a little bit, but believe it or not, I actually got a job working at that station, that same frequency, in 1993 as a talk show host. And I've mentioned a couple times in passing that I worked in radio on and off, different radio stations, as a disc jockey, but then I was also a talk show host in Flint and Detroit. And the Detroit thing, actually, I did it on a couple different radio stations, but the one that was the most fun and most interesting to me was when I was a talk show host at 99.5, which was the old WABX. Now, ABX got bought in the early 80s and changed formats a couple times. They became Class FM, didn't work. 99 DTX, which worked a little bit, but then not much. They became the Fox. And then in January of 93, they went talk. They were a talk FM talk. They were an FM talk station. And that was very unusual at the time, FM talk in Detroit. And I remember listening to them going, this is a pretty cool station. And so I sent a tape and a resume into the program director. And I said, hey, look, I'm a longtime radio guy. I'm a lawyer now. I live in the Detroit area. I'd like to come in and do my own show. And no response. I called, left a message, nothing. So, okay, you're not going to get a talk show host job based on being a disc jockey. And one day I'm driving into court and I'm listening to WOW FM. And as I'm driving into court, I hear them promote the evening show with a host named JD. And JD says, hey, everybody tune in at 7 o'clock tonight because I'm going to have, we're going to be talking about car dealership ripoffs. Buying a used car, selling a used car dealer ripoffs. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I race back to my office, type up a letter. I had a word processor, but you know what I'm saying. And then I faxed it to the radio station and said, hey, JD, I'm an attorney. I specialize in this. I'd love to talk to you about this. The guy calls me and goes, oh, Steve, would you like to call into the show tonight? I'll put you on the air and we'll banter. And I said, well, I'd be happy to do that. I go, but I live in Birmingham and you guys are in Royal Oak at the time. Why don't I just come into the station? And he goes, oh, you want to do this? Sure, come on down. So I went down to the station, went into the place, met the guy. Guy goes, come on in here. We're in the studio. The studio is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Mixing console about yay wide. Looks like it's the dashboard of the space shuttle. It's so advanced compared to anything I ever worked at any other radio station. And they've got, cart racks and all kinds of other stuff coming in over here. But they don't play music for the most part, so they don't have turntables. They did have CD players also. But it's just, and then 20 incoming phone lines because it's a call-in talk show most of the time. And he goes, sit down, and he gives me a microphone, and I'm sitting on the other side of the board from him. Now, here's a couple things I got to tell you, is that the station had a strange format in that they decided they wanted to compete directly with WJR and WWJ, who are AM stations. One was all news talk, and one was talk. And so to compete with them, they thought, well, we need to do traffic and weather every 10 minutes, which is death in a talk show format. Because you get a guest on, you're rolling, you go, I got to stop for traffic and weather. You stop for traffic and weather. Now back to the guest for another 8.5 minutes. Up, traffic and weather. Talk about just speed bumps in the show. But they did it. They also had an echo on the signal, which I found annoying. People said you'd get used to it. I don't know why they did it, but every single voice on the station sounded like this, but with an echo. And it was kind of annoying. And now I hear the tapes of what I sounded like back then, and I'm like, I can't stand that echo. I can't stand it. But that's what they did. So I'm in the studio with JD talking about car dealership scams. The phones are lighting up, all kinds of stuff. So during one of the breaks where he's playing commercials and he's not talking to anybody but me, he goes, dude, you need to get a show here. You'd be great here. I said, I'd like to. I sent a tape and a resume to the PD, but he never responded to me. He goes, dude, give me your card. I give him my card. And so he takes one of my cards and goes, I'll have him call you. Next day, the program director calls me. He goes, come on, Dan, I want to talk to you. So I go down to the station and meet the guy face to face. Very, very nice guy. Very, very well-known guy. And he goes, you want to work here? I said, yeah, I'd love to. And he goes, ever done talk before? I go, nope. And he goes, well, here's the thing. He goes, I'm going to explain to you some very, very basic rules. He goes, number one, I know you're an attorney. He goes, I don't want your show to turn into, oh, I'm a lawyer, get free legal advice. He goes, so I prefer that you not talk about that. Don't mention that you're a lawyer. He goes, we might change that later on, but right now, don't mention that you're a lawyer. And I go, okay, but I thought that'd be a big selling point. He goes, no, people don't tune in because there's a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant. They want to hear what you're talking about. He goes, so let's talk about the different things you can talk about. So we start talking about things in the news. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to grab the Free Press or News, one of the two newspapers in town, find stories in the news that are interesting. And then he goes, and here's the important part. He goes, and this is the opposite of what I do on my channel, by the way. He goes, when you find a story, take a side. And he goes, and take a side that you can defend to the bitter end. And he goes, I do not want to hear you ever say 45 minutes into the hour going, you know, you're right, I changed my mind. Because if you do that, you're doing it wrong. He goes, our goal is not to debate the issues and come to a conclusion. He goes, our goal is to get people talking. You talk, the callers talk, listeners talk. He goes, we want people talking. He goes, so ideally, you might occasionally want to take the other side. And he goes, and if you find something in the news where you are on the other side, knock yourself out because you'll be more enthusiastic about it. I said, you know something, dude? I go, I'm an attorney. I routinely have to go into court and pick a side based on who's hired me. So I know how to do that. And he goes, there you go. There you go. So go into the station, and this is in January or February of 1993. That's when they changed formats to January of 93. And the guy goes, you're going to be doing midnight to 6 from Friday to Saturday and from Saturday to Sunday. And the first time I came in, JD trained me on how to use the board, and the board was so complicated and the format was so complicated that he goes, sit down. I sat in a stool, and there's a mixing console, and he stood behind me, and he'd point as to what buttons I should push. And occasionally I'd go to reach the wrong button, and he'd knock my hand over and hit the right button. But within a little while, I got it. But you have to understand that when you break for the traffic and the weather, for instance, if you've got somebody in the other booth who's doing traffic and weather, which we did a lot of times, and I had a producer also, which is pretty cool. From midnight to 6, if somebody's sitting on this other side of the glass answering my phones and so on. But you had to press all kinds of buttons. So I'm speaking into a microphone, but I say, now it's time for traffic and weather. And I would sometimes have to hit a jingle myself and then read it myself, or I'd have to hit the mic and let the other person get on the air. And then there's commercials. I had to line my commercials up and get ready to hit those. And then when I came back, all the phones. So it was a nightmare to follow this. But it was the most elements I ever did juggle at a radio show. But I got it down, and I managed to do it pretty well. So I would come in at midnight. There'd be a producer. And then till 6 a.m., I'm telling you right now, cell phones were not as ubiquitous then as they are now. Some people had car phones, what we called them mostly back then, and you'd get some calls, but I'd be on the air at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I could be doing anything, and I couldn't get a phone call. It was like trying to raise the dead. And so here's the thing. There are people listening who will never call. You still have to put on a show and learn how to do talk radio when no one's calling. It's a call-in talk show with no callers. Now, I got calls every night, but there were hours where I got no calls. And I remember there was one producer, and I wish I remembered his name, but there's one producer, a young guy, and I jokingly said to him, I said, you know, about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse. And every now and then I look over at him, and if we made eye contact, he'd start pretending like he was beating a dead horse. Dude, I'm dying over here. You get to do the traffic and the weather. I got to come back on and say, okay, we're talking about, redistricting or whatever. trying to revive those phone lines. But there were some nights where it was rocking all night long, had a great time, and had a lot of fun at that station. But the sad part is that in May of 1993, they changed formats. And as radio stations often do, they did not announce it. And it was a surprise to everybody. And the reason I say that is that they changed, and I forgot the exact date in May of 1993. But I was driving home from work on Friday, thinking to myself, tonight I got to go in and do my talk show, my talk show hosting job. And on the drive home, I turned on the radio, and they're playing country music. And I got a digital tuner. It's not mistuned. It is, in fact, they're playing country music. And they're calling themselves Young Country, WYCD 99.5, Detroit. Young Country. Now, Detroit already had a country station at W4, the old rock and roll station. But Young Country came in and said, hey, we're going to not be playing that twangy stuff your grandfather listened to. We're going to play the young stuff, okay? And so they're doing that. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I have a feeling that they're not going to break for a talk show at midnight tonight. What's going on? But nobody bothered to call me. And don't get me wrong, I was the lowest guy on the totem pole. There was no one lower than me. I was the guy doing overnight weekends, and they, I'm sure, pulled aside all of the people who were on the air during the day and broke the news and said, guys, at 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock, whatever it is, we're changing formats. And they actually kept some of the hosts. They said, if you want to stay on as a country DJ, we'll let you do it. And a couple of them stuck around. Dr. Don Carpenter stuck around. He was a host before that on the talk station. And so I'm like, what do I do? So I tried calling the station, no answer. I did not have any other phone numbers for the people at the station because I always called them at the station. Didn't have a number to call JD directly, so I couldn't get an answer from him. And so all I had was, I had a key card that got me in the building, and I was supposed to be there at midnight. So I thought to myself, I know they changed formats. Do I really? Yeah, I need to go. And so just because that's how I am, no one told me not to go. At 11 o'clock, I drove to Royal Oak, walked into the building, stuck in my key card, and it didn't work. I had been unceremoniously fired, like everybody else who didn't want to do country music. And they didn't bother asking me at that time. So interestingly, they owed me a paycheck. So a couple days later when I had time, jumped in my car, drove to Royal Oak, went into the building. Key card wasn't necessary during business hours. Went up to the front desk and said, hi, I'm Steve Lehto, used to do weekends here, and haven't been doing weekends the last couple weekends, but I believe I got a paycheck laying around here somewhere. And they said, oh, yeah, hang on a second. And a guy who was the production director, and again, I apologize, I should know his name, but then again, this is a while ago, 30 years ago. He had been the production manager, came out, he's the guy who made the commercials and so on. He goes, come on back. And he had been appointed interim program director. And we sat in his office. And he goes, I'm sure you noticed we've changed formats. And I said, I kind of figured it out when my key card didn't work. And he goes, yeah, sorry about that. He goes, it was a nightmare of just the transition where, we had to hire a bunch of new people. We had a bunch of people say they were going to stay, but they didn't, vice versa. Just the transition is a nightmare. I'm sure I said, no, dude, I've worked in radio. I know how radio works. He goes, do you want a job as a weekend disc jockey here? And I said, no, I'm really sorry. And he goes, no, I understand. Because I was just going to ask you if you wanted to. I was going to let you consider that. And I said, no. I said, that's fine. I wasn't really in the mood to play young country versus being a talk show host. So he gave me my last check, and we shook hands and left on good terms. But that's the crazy part about radio, is that happens all the time. All the time. And one of the reasons that I started thinking about this was I'm reading a book right now about the history of Cleveland radio. And it talks a lot about WMMS, the buzzard, and how they became market dominant in Cleveland. And at one point in time, some people from Detroit came down and got a radio station, WNCX. And they said, we're going to topple the buzzard. And they just made absolute jackasses themselves and didn't topple anything. And they changed formats a couple times in quick succession, which is also death in radio. And the people behind that radio station were behind 99 DTX, one of the prior iterations of this radio station before it became Wow FM and then became Young Country. So when it was 99 DTX, they called it pop radio. And Jim Harper was one of the guys behind that. He was also one of the guys behind WNCX. And so I was reading this chapter talking about the history of WNCX, and they go, oh, Jim Harper from Detroit and 2 other people came down, bought this station, and said, yeah, we're going to topple the buzzard, which, again, they didn't topple anything. But I'm like, oh, that's right. WDTX is one of the precursors of WOW FM. So the ironic thing was that my first job in radio wasn't really paying, but I was an intern at WABX back in 81 or 82. And then later on, that same frequency became WOW FM and then Young Country. And the weird part is that they were in Royal Oak when I worked there. They were in, on Coolidge. I forgot it was considered Berkeley, or I forgot the town it was in. Not Ferndale, but it was down in that direction, just a little office building, a little nondescript office building. But it had moved several times. And at one point, it was over in Southfield, then it was in Royal Oak. I'm not even sure where it is now. I have no idea. But it was the same signal. So it had been ABX for years. And then Class FM, 99 DTX, the Fox, WOW FM, and then Young Country. And that's when I was locked out of the building with a key card that didn't work. But I got my last paycheck, which is better than some disc jockeys can say. So there you go. My time in Detroit as a talk host. I did come back later and do a couple other talk shows, short-lived things, nothing major. But the WOW FM thing was kind of cool because I was part of an experiment. Later on, talk radio returned to Detroit on the FM. And for a long time, they kept claiming they were the first FM talk station in Detroit. It's like, guys, you forgot about WOW FM. But radio is also full of a lot of what we call bluster. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.